Elizabeth's official title here is Associate Research Professor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And I make a point about that because, first of all, faculty members like to have their titles mentioned. But apart from that, Elizabeth arrived here at a point when she not only was not an associate research professor, but she was putting really, she can disagree with this if she thinks I'm twisting it a little bit, but she was putting a career together, but she wasn't quite sure what that was going to look like. But she had some ideas, and she had very firm priorities, and those priorities had to do with honoring her education. She had a PhD in political science from Washington, D.C., but she decided she didn't want to stay in Washington for her career, and she had a PhD in political science, so she was academically trained. She knew how to do research. She knew about teaching, but she had very strong priorities for how you shape a life. And so she is an example of someone who has created and shaped the life that she wanted to have. And I hope she's not going to get up here and contradict me by saying this isn't what she wanted at all. But She came here to Eagleton, and we had just started work. We'd always worked, our work had always had to do with young people and education and civic engagement and civic education, because that's part of the mission and the heart and soul of Eagleton, and the legacy we have from the bequest from Florence Peshine Eagleton, after whom the Institute is named. Nonetheless, the work that we were doing in our various centers and programs while we were educating young people, and those were our underlying values, we didn't have a specialized focus on the newest thinking, the newest research, and the way to deal with young people. We were focused on state legislators, we were focused on women, we were focused on public opinion polling, a lot of different areas of specialty here at Eagleton. And when Elizabeth arrived, we were just beginning to say, we should also, after all, we're on a university campus, and we have a few things to say about the subjects that really speaks right to the mission of the Institute. And Elizabeth came in, and I'm not even sure she knew what she was going to do with it, but she started in the most both systematic but also experimental, step-by-step way of putting together her thinking with the current state of education, the current issues and needs facing our society and young people. And she began to put a program together, and she had this life she wanted to lead. So for years it was, I'll work 3 days a week, or I'll work 4 months a year, and she would plan it out, and that's exactly what she would do, exactly on that schedule. And I would from time to time check and say, so are you going to go the traditional faculty route at some point or something like that? No, that's not what she was interested in. She was going to go a life that she created and carved out for herself, and that's exactly what she did. And so Elizabeth has been here from the point that we created the Youth Political Participation Program, which she directed and built, to the point last spring, just a year ago, when a number of us who are in the room now gathered to celebrate converting that into something called the Center for Youth Political Participation at Eagleton. And that meant that she had managed over all those years to acquire one staff person, and so she could be a center. He's sitting right over here. PowerPoint. So you could be a center once you're not a one-person show. And they're building. And plus, she had developed several very important programs focusing on different aspects of youth political participation and her expertise on the millennial generation. And that one of them had to do with specifically Rutgers. One had to do with an education program linked to New Brunswick High School, and all of this was about leadership and about voting. And then she took up something that we had begun, but she's taken it beyond where we were, and that is a national focus on young people in elected office. So there are a lot of other things, and those are just, I'm not naming them all especially, but those are just the broad areas. In the meantime, she said, well, I think now I'm going to work full-time, and then after that it came, now my children are at this stage in their lives, and so I think I might actually be able to work during the summers. And so we've gone incrementally. They're now practically full adults, and she is working full-time and has gone through a professional advancement, not just in the work that she's done here, but I do want to make mention of the fact that she is now more and more nationally recognized as an expert, a researcher, a writer, an educator about youth engagement and education, and the American Political Science Association has honored her with an award, and she got a special award a year ago, also through the APSA. So she is now a national figure in this field. And on top of all that, she said to me a few years ago, I am working with the American Political Science Association on some edited text, and I'm going to be a web editor for some things, but I think I'm going to write my own book too. Okay. And she gave me a schedule, and she did it. She wrote her own book, and we're here to celebrate that. So I want to hold up 2 volumes that in all of this Elizabeth has managed to produce. The one where she's the lead editor, which is very heavy, called Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines. And this is supported by the American Political Science Association, and it's a very important resource. And now the one that we're here celebrating today, and the young man outside at the table told me that I have to tell you that it's 10% off if you buy it today. And it's called Citizen Now, Engaging in Politics and Democracy. She is going to be talking about that. But I just want to close this by saying that it has been just such a pleasure to watch someone who, and I want you to know your mother agreed with me, or she confirmed my thinking. I told her what my experience is, partly because it's an embarrassment to me, that when Elizabeth says she's going to do something, she does it exactly on time. She does it all the way. She doesn't complain about not meeting any deadlines, and she does it as a very good citizen of this institute as well, participating in all kinds of now committees and other activities here. So I am in awe of her life and her career, and I am now going to shut up and welcome you to the podium. Professor Elizabeth Matto.
Well, if anyone ever needs an ego boost, just ask Ruth Mandel to do an introduction for you. So thank you very much, Ruth, for that very kind introduction, and for, in many ways, serving as a role model for me, as I've been here over 10 years at Eagleton. And a big thank you to Ruth and John for allowing me to make the Eagleton Institute of Politics my professional home. And, Dorothy's right, there's no place like home. So thank you very much. And as Ruth suggested, I want to thank everyone for being here today. Some of you have traveled from around the globe and across the country. Some of you have come from the 3rd floor in College Ave. And so on a day like today, on a muddy day like today, I'm very grateful. So as you know, books take a while to get written and to get published. And when your topic is a current one, you always run the risk of, once the book is finally out and you're ready to start talking about it, perhaps conditions have changed. So certainly, I had a little panic attack when a few weeks ago, the topic of this book really is the millennial generation. And a few weeks ago, the Pew Research Center announced that it had officially ended, or had declared that from now on, those born after 1997 would not necessarily be considered millennials, but post-millennials. So I didn't necessarily panic, but instead, even better, you feel a sense of vindication, or I told you so. Because, much, as I'm going to talk a little bit about today, much of the research on millennials and their political behavior has offered either a contradictory or an uncertain picture, sort of a muddy picture of youth political participation, and in many ways have even undersold the extent to which young adults are involved in politics. And the case studies that I conducted, and I'm going to share some of that research today, suggest that actually there is a strong undercurrent of political engagement that was taking place among the millennials that I was studying in my research that really wasn't being recognized in the current academic literature. And in many ways, I think what we've seen in the last year, what we've seen in the last few months, even has been foreshadowed by some of the work that I did. So I'm excited to share that with you. So, in a nutshell, the book that I wrote offers a snapshot of what we know about the millennial generation. It also dissects our study of the generation, where we've gotten it right and where we've screwed up, where there's more to do. And I offer a different take, a new take on studying youth political participation. And out of that, hopefully come some suggestions for how we might better understand the generation as a whole, but specifically their political engagement. So I'll share some of that with you today, but I'm certainly happy to engage in some discussion. As everyone knows, I certainly got a lot of press calls in the last few months, the terrible Parkland shooting, but then the subsequent school walkouts and the March for Our Lives has really sparked a lot of discussion about the state of youth political participation right now, and even some excitement. So for example, in our own lovely Star Ledger, the day after the march, the headline was "Welcome to the Revolution." And one of the op-eds was, "For the old lions who have fought this fight before, they say it's about time." Similarly, as this movement was sort of coming together, there was a tweet put out by President Obama that read, "Young people have helped lead all our great movements. How inspiring to see it again in so many smart, fearless students standing up for their right to be safe, marching and organizing to remake the world as it should be. We've been waiting for you, and we've got your backs." So the thing that pops out to me from that quote is the "we've been waiting for you," because I think in many ways that really reflects a prevailing sentiment about the millennial generation, specifically their political engagement. It's a generation with a lot of promise, a lot of unique features, and that makes them very powerful, or at least has the potential for power. But at least when it comes to exercising that political power, there's been uncertainty, confusion, and almost a sense of a promise not yet fulfilled. So I think that's what I read from a quote like this. So I want to talk, just to start by, for my students here, you've heard this, so please forgive me. But it's worth at least emphasizing what those features are. What is it that makes this generation interesting, unique, sets it apart from other generations? For the most part, it depends on who you read, but basically anyone born after about 1978, 1980 has been considered a millennial. And they have a number of distinguishing characteristics, and as I say, sort of a generation of superlatives. You're always hearing it's the biggest, it's the most, so for example, it's always, one thing that's often remarked about millennials is just the size of the generation, that it was on track to exceed the size of the baby boom generation. So just by size alone can exert a great deal of power. It's the most diverse generation in American history, ethnically diverse generation in American history. Very well educated, a generation that at this stage in their life, they are exceeding the levels of education that their previous generations had at that stage of their life. At the same time, it's a generation that has been was uniquely affected by the Great Recession. A generation that has financial burdens that other generations haven't had. The student loan debt crisis, for example, is something that is burdening that generation in particular. There's a lot of good research put out by Pew about the challenges that this generation is going to have to catch up or save or buy a home. And then, there are a number of other special features or skill sets I would say this generation has that have emerged in a lot of survey research. So, for example, although they are the most economically, facing economic challenges that other generations haven't faced, they tend to be still a very optimistic generation. A generation very interested, unlike mine, I'm Generation X and we're the slacker generation and take great pride in the fact we're slackers. It's a generation that has an interest in making things better, want to improve the conditions of their community. At the same time, it's a generation very frustrated by processes that don't seem to make sense, or bureaucracies that are slow and cumbersome. And so, as I said, it's a generation that wants to make things better, wants to improve things, also really sees their lives as an extension of their values, whether it's what they're buying, what they're wearing, what they're watching. So with all of that being said, as I said, there's sort of a sense that this is a unique generation with the potential for a great amount of power. And certainly, it's a generation that can impact and has impacted the economy, workplace, culture, politics. But what I'm interested in looking at is how has this power manifested itself, if it has all this great potential. So one way I did this was I went about some research in which I studied our perceptions of the generation. And did that by building a database of over 350 news articles, just from 4 newspapers over a fairly limited amount of time, but pulled together over 350 articles just on millennials, and was interested in and engaged in content analysis to get a sense of the news frame through which millennials have been covered, because the way in which a subject is covered often has a significant impact on the way in which we receive it and the way in which we act towards it. And what I found really interesting was illuminating on many fronts, as you even see just from this slide. Just the generation itself, the topic of the millennial generation, often elicits strong and often contradictory perceptions of the generation. On the one hand, they're referred to as Generation Nice, and look how happy all those young adults are, but then also referred to as the me generation by Time magazine. And the subtitle is Millennials Are Lazy, Entitled Narcissists Who Still Live with Their Parents. And why they'll save us. So even within the title itself, it's contradictory. So when I was looking at all of these articles, as I said, there's a lot of contradictions within them. One thing that was really clear was the significant impact that the generation has had on the economy, on marketing, the way businesses have responded to the generation as a whole. Whether it's Keds and Calvin Klein and how they sell shoes, even restaurants and the way they the way they have their food offered and how you can order. Normally I wouldn't put a bunch of quotes up here, but this was content analysis, so this is my data. So for example, the extent to which this generation, this great powerful generation, has influenced the way restaurants do business. So for example, this quote from the LA Times. They're not just looking for tasty treats at a good value. What they want is much more complicated, an emotional connection to a brand, connection to a brand that is socially responsible and sustainable, using thoughtfully chosen ingredients and considerately employed workers. So the idea that the choices you make, the restaurant you go to, is an extension of your values. Similarly, I found an article on wedding planners and how they're trying to adjust their business based on millennials. Instead of traditional must-haves like engraved invitations or sit-down dinners, millennials seek touches that showcase their interests and personal style. So again, a unique generation that wants to express their unique features in their purchasing power. What was really interesting when it gets to, what is our perception of their involvement in politics? When I looked at all of these articles, there were far, far more about their economic impact, relatively few about their political power, and if anything, very opinionated and often contradictory. So for example, I'll share one quote from you from the New York Times, very snarky quote from the New York Times regarding millennials. And it reads, "In the future, it seems there will be only one ism, individualism, and its rule will never end. As for religion, it shall decline. As for marriage, it shall be postponed. As for ideologies, they shall be rejected. As for patriotism, it shall be abandoned. As for strangers, they shall be distrusted. Only pot, selfies, and Facebook will abide, and the greatest of these shall be Facebook." So there's one take on the worldview of millennials and the impact they may be having on not only culture at large, but politics in particular. Then there's the sunnier version written by a millennial. "My generation is sowing the seeds of social entrepreneurship and activism that will propel America to success in future generations. We, the millennials, are passionately screaming at the top of our lungs." So certainly a positive take on millennials' impact on culture, but also politics. But again, when it came to actually dissecting how do we perceive the role of young adults in the political process, very uncertain and very tentative, and if anything, sort of looking ahead to the future, the idea that if young adults participate in politics, they could make a really big impact. And I think that would be expressed in this quote I have from the LA Times. Democrats must understand that while the next generation of voters is open to their message, they can't be taken for granted. When they get older and pay more taxes, some will surely bolt. And Republicans had better accept that if they remain a party of social conservatives, They're on their way out of business soon. So again, the idea that when they get engaged, when they're mobilized, there could be an impact. Let's just try to figure out what this impact is. So that's sort of the perceptions take. Now I want to shift from perception to reality and talk a little bit about this potential for power and how it's been exercised so far at the ballot box. So this table documents voter turnout rates between 1972 and 2012, goes up to 2012 in the book. This is for presidential elections. I have another slide for midterm elections. But as you see, the different lines, looking at different age cohorts. So the square is 18 to 24-year-olds. The circle is 25 to 44-year-olds. The triangle, 25 to 64. And the last one is 65 plus. So as you see, from 1972 on, certainly youth voter turnout rates have declined. It's not like they were that high to begin with, but certainly by the time you get to about 1996, and that's about when millennials are voting for the first time, you start to see a significant difference between these generations. Certainly the same holds true for midterm rates. If you're looking, around 1994, 1998, when millennials are just starting to go to the ballot box, voter turnout rates in 1998 were 16 percentage points. So again, there was a steady decline in youth voter turnout rates anyway that was sparking concern among scholars and practitioners. But certainly, as you're getting closer to maybe the millennial generation, you're seeing a bigger difference between this generation and previous generations. One of the questions that's often asked in political science and when you're looking at voter turnout rates and especially youth political participation is, well, is it the fact that they're millennials, or is it just the fact that they're young? Maybe they'll start voting once they get older. And certainly I did see some evidence when I was looking at millennials specifically, kind of going year by year and tracking as they got older, did their voter turnout rates increase? And they do, slightly. I think the thing that's so important to note, though, is if you compare millennials to maybe baby boom generation, World War II generation, millennials are starting further behind when it comes to where their benchmark, where their original voter turnout rates are. So I was able to get some data from the Census Bureau that documents this and really just looks at the turnout rates of 18 to 25-year-olds, 25 to 44-year-olds in 1964. So that would be, in 1964, 18 to 24-year-olds are currently 66 to 72, and 25 to 44-year-olds, 73 to 92. And as you see, comparing to the earlier graphs, 18 to 24-year-olds in 1964, currently, World War II generation, late baby boom, early World War II, were voting at 50%. The presidential turnout rates were at 50%. For millennials, they're about 30%. And similarly, you see even stronger ones for 25 to 44-year-olds. So I won't belabor this table, but just the notion that, yes, when people get older, their turnout rates do increase. And certainly there's a good chance millennials, their turnout rates will increase also. It's a question of will they ever match the turnout rates of previous generations? They're starting at a completely different level than World War II generation or baby boom generation. So when it comes to this generation of great promise and how do they distinguish themselves, it's not necessarily in voter turnout rates or at the ballot box. Certainly one area where young adults, or there's been this potential for power that is unique to their generation would be the extent to which they engage, and it depends on which side of the coin you're on. For some, it's hashtag activism. For some, it's slacktivism. The extent to which young adults use social media, the internet, to engage in political behavior. And so we certainly know that a large number of millennials do use platforms of social media to engage in political behavior. It doesn't necessarily replace traditional forms of political engagement. But again, the question of, is that political engagement? Is, liking something on Facebook, is sharing an article on Facebook the same as the voter turnout rates you're seeing, among older generations? So given what the turnout rates have been among millennials and this notion that they may not be distinguishing themselves in that way, but are there other ways in which they're distinguishing themselves as citizens? I want to sort of shift gears and talk about how scholars study this, how scholars try to wrestle with this. What I found as I was doing my research is there really have been competing theoretical conceptualizations of youth engagement. And, probably not surprisingly, these competing conceptualizations of engagement have rendered different conclusions on whether or not young adults are engaged or disengaged or somewhere in between. And this is something that Russell Dalton wrote about in his first book, and it prompted him to come up with a different conceptualization of youth political participation. For me, it sparked a different approach to studying it. But just to kind of give you an idea of what these different conceptualizations of engagement look like, as scholars have been trying to wrestle with the nature, the degree, the extent of youth political participation. You know, there's some, such as Wattenberg, such as Robert Putnam, who would argue that, you know, if you're looking at the quality of youth political participation right now, it's pretty poor, or they're disengaged. And much of that has to do with the fact that when they think about engagement, they put politics at the dead center of it. Engagement has to do with being traditional forms of political engagement, such as voter turnout. All the other stuff is on the periphery, whether it's discussing politics, sharing an article online, expressing your political opinion, following the news, that, you know, real engagement has to do with voting, political engagement, pure political engagement. There are others who would say, well, it's not so much that young adults are disengaged, it's just they're engaged differently. And it comes up in different formats, or there are different facets of engagement. And they have built a typology in different quadrants, different types of engagement that are related and intersect sometimes, and there are porous lines between these categories, but they're all sort of on an even plane. It may be that they're volunteering in their community, trying to solve a problem in their community. It may be that they're trying to determine who sits in office, so actually participating in elections. It may be they're expressing their political opinion to try to sway their actions, to sway the actions of elected officials, or it may just be cognitive. It may just be they're reading the news, they're talking about politics, that these are all just different forms of engagement. And then the last one that I would say, my little umbrella, that the idea of very expansive definition of engagement. And it all falls under the umbrella of civic engagement, and you have voting, and you also have, you know, talking about politics, that it all sort of falls under this big umbrella, very expansive definition of engagement. What I argue is that first of all, the fact that there are all these competing conceptualizations of engagement means we probably are at a standstill and we're not accomplishing much. And we're not going to do much as far as understanding youth political participation if we're defining it, if we're just sort of locked in this definition between what is the right conceptualization. And what I basically argue, and for me, that's encouraged me to take a different approach. That if there is this competition, there's one, I would say one of my critiques is that by conceptualizing engagement either in the center graphic or the one on the left, you run the risk of undervaluing the importance of political engagement. When we start to see voting as interchangeable with discussing politics or volunteering in your community, I think there are even some examples of, you know, correcting someone when they say an offensive joke. All good things that we want people to do, but is that the same as engagement? Is that the same as political engagement? So one argument I offer is that there are downsides to conceptualizing engagement in that way. And also I argue that political scientists who are sort of locked in this battle between concepts and frameworks are missing key components of politics that we used to that were core features of politics, such as making sure that we're actually talking about actions and not necessarily interest. Actually, what are people doing to engage in the political process? Are these actions voluntary and done by average citizens, or is it elites that are organizing these actions? Are they directed at government officials or governmental activities? And is there a goal? Is there a result? Is there something they're hoping to accomplish at the end? Often that's lost in conceptualizations that are really broad. So what I offer too, and I would also say, for the most part, and I don't think my colleague Ashley Koenig is here, I love survey research, but much of the research on youth political participation has been survey research, and has really looked at the exact same things in the exact same ways. And there are other ways to study youth political participation. And so that's what I embark on, and I'll share a little bit of that, and we can have a discussion afterwards. But instead of just looking at their actions, I also look at, I think it's worth, or I offer an argument that's worth looking at the targets of their actions, the issues that bring people together, that bring young adults together, the goals that they have in mind, what they seek to accomplish at the end. So what I did was I I engage in what's referred to as a qualitative methodology that's really understudied when it comes to millennials, and really puts the researcher in the shoes of the young people engaging in this political engagement, and allows us to consider the issues that mobilize them, the targets, their goals, the effects of their actions, and allows us to sort of better integrate their experiences into our appreciation. So what I did is I did 3 case studies of 3 youth-led organizations that were formed as a response to the issue that is most burdened this generation, the economy. And I was able to identify these 3 organizations through my content analysis. So I want to share a little bit about what I learned about them. So just to start, just a reminder with case studies, my case study research involved interviews with key figures in these groups, observations, content analysis of their social media platforms, websites, et cetera. So let me introduce you to them, and I'll tell you a little bit of what I learned from them. So the first organization that I looked at is called Young Invincibles. And Young Invincibles was an organization formed by some friends who went to law school together in Georgetown. So they met in Washington, D.C., met in Georgetown, and were very interested in healthcare policy, and in particular, the effects of healthcare policy on millennials, and wanting to make sure millennials had a seat at the table. So that was the impetus of the creation of this organization. And so that was the heart of it, but it also has encompassed other economic issues that are important to young adults, and such as college affordability, job availability. And as I said, formed by a group of students at Georgetown. When I went and interviewed them, they had a nice office on K Street in Washington, D.C. So if you all know K Street, that's where the heavy hitters are. So that's where Young Invincibles was based, and they are still in existence, strong as ever. When I met them a few years ago, they had a number of actual offices with staffs all around the country, and they are still in existence, and as I said, probably doing better than ever. The next group I looked at was a group called The Can Kicks Back. It has a great mascot. So The Can Kicks Back was formed as a way to offer the youth perspective when it comes to fiscal policy and the debt. And the founders of this group, The Can Kicks Back, argued that basically, unlike previous generations, millennials weren't going to kick the can down the road. Instead, they were going to be the generation that kicks back. And when I interviewed them, interestingly, I was on the same trip to DC. I had gone to the nice office on K Street to interview the people from Young Invincibles. And I ended up having an interview with the executive director at the Can Kicks Back at a coffee shop in Foggy Bottom, because they had no more office space and they were closing down. So it was actually fantastic, because I was able to really chart their beginnings and their middle and their end. So I can share a little bit of that with you also. Unlike Young Invincibles that had staffs and offices around the country, they had really emphasized trying to start chapters on college campuses, which certainly has its benefits, but also had its drawbacks also. And the last group I looked at that emerged based on my content analysis, a group that had formed surrounding the issue of the economy, formed by young adults, was called San Bernardino Generation Now, based in San Bernardino, California. And what sparked their creation was something very close to home, the bankruptcy of San Bernardino, of the city of San Bernardino. In 2012, San Bernardino was designated the second poorest city in the country. They were riddled with financial and political problems, political corruption, and declared bankruptcy. And it's a very large youth population in San Bernardino, heavily Latino population. So a group of young adults who had roots already in community organizing came together. Most of them are students or in their early 20s with jobs. So when I met them, they purposely have a very loose structure. They don't have an office space. They don't want an office space. They like to stay sort of organic and nimble. So I just met them after their workday, about 8 o'clock at night, in an office they had borrowed. So it was interesting to have 3 different perspectives on really the same topic, again, with a youth focus and youth-led. So as I said, I want to share what I learned when it comes to their political engagement. And we can open it up, but certainly what I found that was most interesting, especially in light of the fact that, as I'm teaching political engagement in the classroom and exploring all these conceptual models with students, and we're thinking of engagement even broader and broader and broader, not necessarily looking political. What was so interesting about all three of these groups is how explicitly traditionally political they are, or they were, and that their actions were very much kind of classic textbook political engagement. They may have used, high-tech new technology, but it was still good old-fashioned political engagement. So I want to just run through what I learned regarding the steps they took when it came to raising awareness, engaging in their communities, and obviously political engagement. For all three of them have websites and Facebook pages and Twitter accounts, and certainly they use all of these social platforms as ways to share information and, raise consciousness among their members. The one on the left is from Young Invincibles, tend to give a lot of infographics and fact sheets about how the economy affects the everyday life of young people. So very data-driven, lots of white pages. The one on the right is from San Bernardino Generation Now. Much of their consciousness raising has to do with helping people understand their city, appreciate their city. Often they hold mixers, lots of in-person workshops, in-person mixes at local businesses, whether it's a taco store or bowling alley. Again, to sort of help people connect to the city of San Bernardino. The Can Kicks Back was fun in that they took pride in the fact they were irreverent. They tried to be irreverent, they tried to be sarcastic, they tried to be snarky in whatever way they could. With, I think, the intention of using these platforms as a way of engaging young adults. Probably the most successful social consciousness raising or method they used was surprisingly, it was a surprise to them, had a video that went viral that I'd like to share with you, in which Senator Alan Simpson figures prominently. Now, I will spare you and me the embarrassment of singing the song, but this was coming out at the time that there's a famous Korean song called Gangnam Style, as people may know. They did a takeoff of that, and were able to enlist the support of Senator Alan Simpson, and as a way of raising awareness and consciousness about this topic.
Time now for the ridiculous. And tonight, I'm proud to present to you a very important message from the esteemed former senator from Wyoming, Mr. Alan Simpson. Now, this requires your full attention. It is a message from one of the country's most highly respected elder statesmen directed to the youth of America.
Stop Instagramming your breakfast and tweeting your first world problems and getting on YouTube so you can see Gangnam Style.
Now, normally I would say that when former Senator Alan Simpson does it, it probably means that Gangnam Style has officially jumped the shark. But I think the dancing can of soda next to him kind of saves it. It adds a kind of a fresh twist. Oh, and there's more.
Start using those precious social media skills to go out and sign people up on this baby. 3 people a week, let it grow, and don't forget, take part or get taken apart. Boy, these old coots will clean out the treasury before you get there.
So it's a video for a group called the Can Kicks Back, a nonpartisan campaign by young people to fix the national debt. And I think they're totally onto something with this video. I feel like any time you get to your Alan Simpson, say, these old coots, and talk about Instagramming your breakfast, it not only screams fiscal responsibility, it also could be used in peace talks and quite possibly could cure the common cold.
So I'll stop there. But so as I spoke to Ryan Schoeneke, who is the executive director, so that was incredibly popular. They got so much attention. Not only were they on Anderson Cooper, they were on everything. And then got a lot of interest in their organization. What was interesting was the organization folded a few months after that. They really did not have the structure to support that level of interest and that level of engagement. So it's an important lesson too. Young adults may have, or these groups may have these tools of social media that are supposed to be, signify success. But if you don't have the underlying structure, it doesn't matter. So in addition to, just trying to raise awareness, the groups in different ways also engaged in a lot of work in their communities. But what I thought was very interesting, especially about Young Invincibles and San Bernardino Generation Now, is they really wove a lot of politics into their service work. I would say especially San Bernardino generation now. Young Invincibles had a number of healthcare fairs where they were trying to sign people up for Obamacare, so that's fairly blatant political engagement and a service opportunity. But also the work that San Bernardino generation now did, they often used, especially park cleanups. They do a lot of park cleanups in San Bernardino, and they use it as an opportunity to get community members to understand the role that they can play, the role that politics can play in their everyday lives. One quote from our conversation, they said, "We would love to see some events at this park in the future, but we must take ownership of it first. City officials, we hope, will soon get their budget in order and help towards the park's beautification. The park belongs to us, the community must therefore care for it as such." I just want to show you a little, in contrast to Senator Simpson doing Gungam style, just introduce you a little bit to San Bernardino generation now.
Hi, my name is Matthew Greenlee. I'm a member of San Bernardino Generation Now. Oops, we gotta do that.
My name is Judith and I'm 11 years old.
Hi, my name is Raul Gutierrez. I've been living in San Bernardino all my life.
We chose Second because Second is overall a very beautiful park. It's probably the best park in San Bernardino that gets the least amount of love. I mean, no park in San Bernardino has a lake as beautiful as this, or ducks, or bridges, or as far as space and baseball fields, all combined into one. It also needed the most help. Like, the city stopped funding this park, so the trash built up like kind of everywhere, and it took us months to kind of even get it to like a more manageable level where we could kind of make it cleaner on a weekly basis.
Most of my friends are from SBGN, San Bernardino Generation Now, and they also come out here and help clean up the parks.
I've been working with SVGN for about 3 or 4 months now, and the reason I came out and helped them support like the parks and the community is because I saw them get so involved in everything. I saw that they were actually making a difference and wanted to make a change in San Bernardino.
Okay, so there's plenty more to see, and of all of them, San Bernardino now has the most videos on their YouTube channel, so if you want to go learn more about them, I would go on their YouTube channel. But so I would say both when it comes to raising awareness, when it comes to even service and really trying to improve conditions in their community, with all of these groups, there really is woven in a political message and trying to help citizens connect to the role of politics in addressing these needs. And then I would say very blatantly, all of these groups had a very sort of old school traditional approach to politics and political engagement. Whether it was Young Invincibles, as I said, they're located on K Street. Much of their work has to do with lobbying, and they're on the Hill all the time. Lobbying, trying to represent the youth perspective at the policy table. Something from one of my interviews with them, one of them stated, "It's a big belief in our organization that we also have a stake when some of those big policy decisions get made." So just being able to offer information, as we know for those of us who study interest groups, providing useful information to legislators as they're making decisions. Can Kicks Back also was very interested in sort of leveraging their group, leveraging the power of their group and convincing members to vote in their favor. So this one quote from the executive director is, "The goal is to make members fear you. That's the tactic here in DC. That's what the AARP does." So they saw them as being the youth version of the AARP. Now they weren't around much longer, but that was their goal. And also trying to really convince legislators of this large demographic that if mobilized, and certainly that was their goal, was to mobilize these non-voters, that they were really going to listen to the views and follow the opinion, follow the influence of a group like the Can Kicks Back. And then for San Bernardino Generation Now, their political focus was certainly all electoral engagement. Certainly they wanted people to make an investment in their community, understand the role of the political process in their day-to-day lives, but they were very interested in voter engagement and voter education, whether it was voter registration drives, going into high schools, and in general, they wanted to really, as they say in this quote, and I'll read, is to really infuse the city with a sense of civic engagement. The head of San Bernardino Generation Now told me, "People don't understand the power of their vote and the power of their voice. We would like to increase voting in our area, but more importantly, build the culture of civic engagement and get our community educated on politics and the policies affecting our families and our generation. So certainly, 3 case studies has a very limited generalizability for those political scientists in the room. So there's, only so far you can take these lessons. But I know for me, what I found, or some conclusions I came to after studying these 3 groups, especially in light of the sort of the competing models of engagement, was that there's a lot to be learned from looking at this from a different perspective. A qualitative approach, actually looking at it from the perspective of those people that are being studied. There are limitations to organizations, youth-led organizations, in representing and reaching out to all the young adults when it comes to politics. Certainly the example of the Can Kicks Back is an example of that. Trying to maintain college chapters is not easy. We have plenty of students here. They can probably attest to that fact. It's not easy to keep these college chapters going. It's easier when you have an office in all of these places, though, for something like Young Invincibles. But that there were lots of opportunities for these students to learn the skills of political engagement. So Young Invincibles, for example, would train students, their members to go to legislative offices, to try to advocate for your cause. Or, the work of San Bernardino Generation. Now they were in high schools trying to teach high schoolers how to register their parents when they got home. So again, this idea of it's not necessarily elites, sort of top-down political engagement. It's normal citizens, active citizens, learning the skills of citizenship. So, again, what I took from it is, from these 3 groups, there was a sort of old school sense of political engagement with maybe a cutting edge toolbox, a contemporary set of tools. And, I'm not sure that that's being captured, or has been captured, in the research on millennials. So circling back to where I started at the beginning, I can only speculate. Obviously, these are 3 case studies and, decent amount of research. But in many ways, though, I feel looking at what's going on in the not just last 6 months, but in the last year or so, where you are seeing really explicit political engagement, that in many ways it was forecasted, but we weren't necessarily looking for it, or we weren't looking at it in the right way. And given that this study involved looking at young adults formulating or forming about an issue that's uniquely affecting them, certainly as we're looking at something like gun control right now, about an issue that is uniquely affecting young people now, there's much to be learned, I think, or I hope, from the lessons from the research that I did with these case studies. And again, I think there's value in broadening our research angle when we're looking at them. So I'll stop there, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions.
My name's Sandy. I'm from Eastham Township, south of here. I'm also the president of the local school board.
Oh, great.
So I guess my real question is lack of engagement, because you tracked it back to 72. And we know that they didn't vote for Hillary this time,
Some did.
So, where they voted for Obama. So as educators locally, are we failing because civics isn't taught anymore? Mm-hmm. The curriculum is driven by the state and
Correct.
STEM education and park testing.
Right.
But there's nothing about civics anymore. So is that part
yes,
of...
you were preaching to the choir, and you're in the right room. Definitely. I would say if there are generational differences, which I think there are when it comes to millennials and maybe baby boom generation or World War II generation, much of that does have to do with the civics education that other generations, previous generations have had, has not been trickled down, has certainly not been nearly as robust for millennials. And I think, thankfully, there really has been a growth. When we were seeing a decline in youth voter turnout rates, it really did spark a lot of concern and also much more attention to the role of civic engagement education. What should educators be doing? What should policymakers be doing? And there was even some concern for a while. There was actually some debate in the literature that does civics even matter? And for a while, there was certainly a pretty vocal strain that said it doesn't make a difference. Educating people to be civically engaged doesn't make a difference. And that has been debunked. There's a huge amount of research that not only demonstrates that when you teach people to be informed and engaged citizens, it's predictive of future engagement. But there's a great toolkit now on how to do it, evidence-based methods on how to do it that are nonpartisan. But I think certainly, and I would also add, it doesn't necessarily just end at middle school and high school. It's something that can be and should be extended to higher education. And I think that's a tough sell sometimes also. And much of the work that Ruth referenced earlier that I've been doing with the American Political Science Association is first, and we even have to start with political scientists to convince them that that's part of their job. I'm sorry, you're the closest political scientist I know. Not you, you're good. You're very good. But just helping political scientists even see that that is could be part of their mission, should be part of their mission, but that it doesn't mean you have to throw out 20 years of syllabi, and it doesn't mean you have to do everything differently. It doesn't mean you have to doesn't mean you have to be partisan in the classroom, that there are ways to incorporate instructional techniques that are effective at helping students identify the way in which politics matters in their life, the way in which they can influence the political process, and ways that have been tested, are evidence-based. So I would agree with you, and I think given what's been going on, I think in the last year or two, what's been interesting has been how much attention now has been turned, how much attention has turned, I think, to political education in middle schools and higher ed. Yeah.
Just if I could, a quick recap.
Sure.
I'm sorry. We actually, the first day of school when the seniors come in our high school, we register all of them.
Oh, that's great.
And then we mail that in the month that they turn 18.
Right.
So if they're turning 18 in February, we mail it in.
Right.
Now we find in the primary election in June, because we give them an hour off from school, they actually go and vote.
Okay, I was just having this conversation with Rutgers students beforehand. Okay.
So we find that it actually works.
Right.
When we did the follow-up and the data analysis,
right,
a year or two afterwards, when they go to college, the voting pattern has dramatically dropped off.
Well, what's interesting, and I reference it in the book, as the time I was starting this book, there was a real push, number of organizations recommending it. Peter Levine was a very vocal proponent of lowering the voting age to 16. And more for the fact that not necessarily because they needed better representation, but it heightened the likelihood that the habit would be formed earlier. You're still in the home. Your parents will remind you, and so I think there is a push out there to lower the voting age. But I mean, I think as many of us in here, there are scholars and practitioners and a lot of students actually who are involved in this sort of work here on Rutgers campus. It needs to be a multifaceted effort. Whether it's favorable electoral law, that now that we have automatic voter registration in New Jersey, almost, once he signs it, but setting electoral conditions in such a way that it facilitates or is conducive to participation, but then it also, it includes parents talking about politics in home or modeling political behavior. It requires teaching it in the classroom, talking about politics in the classroom. More importantly, it involves candidates and campaigns reaching out to young people. There's a lot of research that shows the importance of voter mobilization, and that often it's not in their best interest necessarily to spend precious resources on voting cohorts that they're not sure are going to show up on election day. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think all of these actors need to be engaged if we're going to have young people participating. But good work. Keep it up. Yes?
Hi, Jeff. Sure. Still can, so that's good. Jeff Davis from Marlborough, New Jersey. Good stuff.
Thanks.
The groups that you talked about were what I would call horizontal groups, in other words, within the millennial generation. What about vertical groups, like the League of Women, well, I don't know how, League of Women Voters I would think is multi-aged, and Sierra Club is another example. How do they, or do the millennials participate in those organizations?
I think we have some people here from the League of Women Voters. Just to give you an idea, the reason I selected these groups was because I selected them because they were organized around an issue that was uniquely affecting the generation, and were organized, pulled together by young adults and led by young adults. I think there is a greater emphasis, I can't speak as much for the Sierra Club, but certainly for other national organizations, Planned Parenthood is probably another one, really trying to reach out and bring in the next generation of advocates and supporters. So I think there is, and again, there's something to be said for having a history, for having a structure, and I think those sorts of organizations are more likely to succeed when you have that existing structure. And again, I think it takes attention to that age cohort. And just what I know of the League of Women Voters, I know there's been a lot of attention towards really targeting young people and including them. So again, I think often the burden or it's certainly the burden is on young people to show up, but there is also an added burden. People need to reach out to them. Organizations are candidates. So I think both are necessary. Kathy.
I'm Kathy Kleeman, and I'm from the baby boom generation. And this segues nicely into what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask you to take off your professor hat and put on your political consultant hat.
Okay.
And what would you say to campaigns about how to engage, what media to use, what methods to use, how to get millennials out?
I might call on some of my millennials that I see sprinkled throughout the audience, but I would say what I found so appealing, and you even saw it in that video for San Bernardino Generation Now, a few things. Helping young adults recognize how their lives are affected by politics, whether they recognize it or not, whether they like it or not. Certainly the work that we have done in New Brunswick High School or here on the college campus is helping them understand, look at your average day. We do this activity with New Brunswick High School students when they come here for our conference. Think about the first 15 minutes of your day, from turning off your alarm to brushing your teeth to getting your cereal to getting on the bus and driving to school, and really helping them identify the ways in which decisions made by either the city council, members of the city council, or the state legislature, or the Board of Education have affected, the quality of their water as they're brushing their teeth in the morning, the potholes or the lack of potholes on the street, the quality of their textbooks once they get to school. So helping them first understand how the decisions made by office holders affect their day-to-day lives. But I think even more importantly, helping them identify ways in which they can influence this process along the way. And certainly we find with the work that we do with Are You Ready, the program we run in New Brunswick High School, the more local the better, the more accessible the better. It doesn't have to be that they run for Senate. We'd love them all to run for office, but it can be just attending their city council meeting. It can be having a one-on-one meeting with a member of their city council. So not only identifying those opportunities, but giving them the skill set, giving them the confidence to go in and actually engage in those activities. When it comes to tools, I would say, I think Gangnam Style is a perfect example. Just because you go viral and just because Anderson Cooper does a story on a video, it still requires, so when all those students who saw that, I want to be a part of the Can Kicks Back, there has to be someone on your college campus who is running that chapter. There has to be something for you to do when you get there. There has to be something really tangible, an action that you can take in your community. And that requires, infrastructure, and that requires a structure that often doesn't exist, that you can't have one without the other, I would say. So something like San Bernardino Generation Now, they've purposely left it kind of loose and organic so they can really move around and be a part of the community and offer sincere opportunities to be involved, not just clicking like, not just sharing something. I think if there's anything we're learning, whether it's political consultants or scholars, is there is still a hunger, a desire to be involved in the process. And I think that's something it touches on a unique feature. The millennials want to be a part. They want to be a part of the process. They want their actions to reflect their values. So I think making it accessible, but letting them have an opportunity to have a legitimate role is important. Aaron is a Rutgers grad who helped on this book. Thank you.
My name's Aaron. I'm from Warren Township, recent Rutgers grad, and I was a research assistant on the project a couple years ago, so I've had a couple years to think of this question, so this really has to be a good one.
You should have warned me.
So my question is about the conceptualization of engagement that millennials have. So you pointed out that they do have these traditional political things at the core of it, But a lot of the time they maybe expect more from their political engagement. They want it to sort of express who they are. And so you may think that this conceptualization is like asking too much of millennials, that it may be such like a high threshold to get involved that they're just not even doing the basics. Do you think that this is a worry? And if so, do you think there's a solution to this?
And that's really one of the critiques that I have of the work by Russell Dalton or the work by Rimmerman, this idea that it's this enlarged sense of engagement that that they argue is actually a better form of engagement. You're not necessarily voting because you feel a duty to vote, but you have a sense that, you're doing it out of not the goodness of your heart, but it's really an extension of your generation. And I think often, right, I agree with you that you're almost setting people up to fail, or you're setting them up in such a way that they aren't necessarily equipped to engage in this sort of broader definition of engagement. It's difficult to sustain, and I think one of my critiques is if there's no attention to what are the results, what are the end goals, what are the effects of these actions, it's not going to be easy. You can't necessarily count your victories, and you can't sort of chart your progress, and then so I think you end up not necessarily sticking with it. I think that's what I've found so interesting, and that's what's been asked of me a couple times regarding Parkland and students who have been involved with March for Our Lives, how immediately and explicitly political their goals have been, almost looking at the electoral timeline, looking ahead not only to their March, but then the primaries coming up, and voter registration deadlines before the primaries, looking ahead to the fall. So really having some milestones or some benchmarks to measure their progress, and a really specific, tangible goal that's reachable and accessible, and can be disseminated throughout the community or throughout the country. Many people can engage in these voter registration drives around the country, and they've put together these little registration toolkits. So I think there is something to be said for having something more, a more solid goal and set of tools or actions to engage in. So thank you, Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Michael with the Collaborative Center for Community-Based Research and Service here at Rutgers, and we run civic engagement and service learning programs. And so, of course, I'm like deeply interested in, and Elizabeth graciously is on our faculty committee. And there's a lot, I have lots of thoughts, so hopefully this will be coherent. Okay. But one of the things
hopefully my answer will be too.
So one of the things that I'm so struck by I guess I'm one of those Generation X people too.
Slackers.
Right. And the difference between when we were in college and now is, to me, a lot of it is economic, right? And so are you able to tease out how much this, with students who are working 30 hours a week just to be here, not, for me was to party, right, and have beer money, but this is, right, but this is, to just be here. And they open up their calendars and they're super scheduled. And then they also worry about, well, if I'm too political and that's on Facebook, future employers are kind of researching me before they hire me. And so they're worried about all of these things. So I was just wondering, with the kinds of research that you're doing, if you're able to kind of see how that impacts it, as well as the civic knowledge, because my students are watching Schoolhouse Rock. And they're still watching Schoolhouse Rock, yeah, and to know how a bill gets passed.
Right.
And so I was just, that's what I
watched
when I was a kid.
Keep watching Schoolhouse Rock.
They are great, but still, they,
right.
They don't really know how to engage, although I see it changing as we have discussions in class and things like that, but, and they're starting to see more the connections that if I'm a scientist, I really need to know how science gets funded, or if I'm a teacher, I'm going to be impacted by policy. They are starting to make those connections that I see in what we do.
Right.
But I really see the economic factors of them just trying to survive,
time, you're saying.
Getting in the way of engagement.
Well, and I think what's so interesting, conversations that often come up with students is, I wouldn't disagree with you. Certainly, I see that in my classrooms. Students, I would agree. Students who are working to just to pay their tuition. So I think what I see as one of my responsibilities is to help students identify, are there political causes for these economic experiences you're facing right now? Are there economic solutions to these, these challenges you're facing right now? Recognizing, again, the idea of them, and it almost goes back to Erin's point, the idea of them putting together their own movement and solving this problem without sort of an existing political structure is unrealistic, and they don't have the time nor necessarily the expertise. So I think that's where the value of having a group that it's not requiring necessarily a heavy lift, but offering opportunities to do meaningful political work, but I think even more importantly, tying the ways in which public policy is affecting their everyday life, whether it's who's sitting in the state legislature and the sort of tuition rates they're paying or the financial aid they're getting or not getting. I think the most successful efforts will be those. I think even if there are students who have very limited time based on economic, certainly, for example, San Bernardino Generation Now. This is, a lot of young people, and it's facing significant economic problems. Many of them are facing issues of immigration, so they have significant burdens also. But what they have done, what I think is so interesting about that group, is how they've really woven the political engagement into your everyday life. Want to go bowling? Come to bowling, but then we're going to have some political candidates there who you can meet at the bowling alley. Want to come clean up a park? You're a graphic design artist and you want to do some, or you want to do graffiti art? Come and, do this work here and your work can be showcased, but then using that opportunity, everyday opportunities of students or young people in San Bernardino as a way then to insert some lessons on politics. And, maybe this park is in this state because of the state of our politics in the city of San Bernardino. So I think those are going to be the most successful efforts. There's some students over here. Emily, maybe she's mine, so I'll start with Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a student, and I'm also in Dr. Matto's CYPP, the program that she introduced. So I already know the answer to this,
Good,
but I'm going to ask
Do
it for the audience. So do you see a value in linking the teaching of the significance of political participation in youth to actually looking for a career, or at least considering one in politics? Because not only will that affect the makeup of government, but also offer them professional experience, and it's not just a minimum wage job, just to say the least.
Right. So certainly, as I say, and you've probably heard me say this a million times, Emily, is that at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, we are nonpartisan, but we think politics is a good thing. We think political participation is a good thing, and we think there are a lot of skills you can learn either by being a volunteer on a campaign or actually, finding yourself as a staffer in a legislative office. So absolutely, we have a program here that we piloted a few years ago called Are You Running?, which is a training for students who might want to run for office one day. But this year we sort of purposely enlarged it and didn't just market it to students if you think you might want to run for office one day, but just understand what all the intricacies of a campaign are. These are all the roles that need filled in a campaign. So I think, yes, helping students understand not only are there opportunities for volunteering, but even building some career skills that even if you don't stay in public service can certainly be useful in other areas. And certainly what we hope, I would say it very blatantly, is that even if you don't make a career in politics, that you will find a way as a volunteer later in your life, finding ways to incorporate political engagement, whether it's serving on a board or commission or volunteering on the PTA. So yes, I think, and there's a lot of interesting, and I would say not just for career goals, but there's a lot of good research. There's a report that came out a few years ago called The Crucible Moment that really argued teaching citizenship is also teaching 21st century professional skills also. There are skill sets that you're going to learn, whether it's communication or presentation or problem solving, critical thinking, that will benefit you in any field. Victor, since you're right next door. And another student.
Thank you. So as a student leader on this campus, I've noticed that, for example, we have some institutions on campus that are kind of for students to express their political engagement. So for example, student government. Mm-hmm. However, growing up and going to public high school here, and as well as coming to Rutgers before I really learned the different types of student government, it seems like there is a strive to make it so that students have less of an impact through their elected positions. At least that's how I feel as a student leader. do you feel like this changing of institutions and changing of the ability of students to actually impact the environments they're in maybe affects the outcome in their political participation, I guess, in society as a
So you
whole?
mean the role that they're playing as student leaders is limited?
Or, for example, they might vote for someone to represent them, but that person might not be able to do anything.
Yeah.
for
So
example.
absolutely. So I would say a couple things. So in many ways, whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school, college, they are microcosms of democracy. And there's a lot of good research that demonstrates that schools, you can really measure and study the political culture of a school, whether it's, again, a high school or a college campus. And you learn a lot of lessons about what does it mean to be a citizen. So, for example, if you go to there's some research about high schools and this issue of democratic culture. If you're at a school where you are very leery about complaining, or you don't feel there are any routes available to you if you want to improve conditions, that teaches you a lesson sort of about your role in society in general. Conversely, if you are in a school that really encourages and fosters opportunities to express your opinion and affect change, then that can have positive lessons. So I would say the same holds true on college campuses. As Ruth mentioned, the book that I'm involved in called Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines, one chapter in there by Nancy Thomas, who people may know from Tufts University, her chapter is called Politics 365. And her argument is basically, on a college campus, teaching citizenship shouldn't just be holding voter registration drives on Constitution Day, or trying to get, sponsoring Election Day shuttles on Election Day. It's something that you can engage and should engage in all the time and embed into the culture of a campus. So one of the points she makes, which touches on your point, Victor, is the idea that it's those college campuses that offer students a legitimate, meaningful role in governance on their campus. And I think that's part and parcel maybe of what you're saying too, is that you really are electing student leaders that have some power. It doesn't matter if they can't do anything. If you have a campus culture that supports that, where students really can play a role in decision making on the campus, that's a positive predictor of future voter turnout rates, for example, on that campus, or that sense of political efficacy on your campus. Some other examples would be, where if you're on a college campus that values political discussion and finds opportunities both in the classroom, in residence life, on the campus, if you're on a campus that actively promotes and encourages political discussion, it's educative. You're teaching students how to engage in political discussion, and in many ways sort of insulates you or inoculates you. Inoculate, is that a word? Have I made that up? I've been talking too long. That less likely to be sort of thrown by issues having to do with academic freedom and free speech and that sort of thing. So I would agree with you entirely. If student leaders don't necessarily have an opportunity to represent the interests of the students, and if it in any way feels like it's just sort of window dressing, that affects, I think, campus culture. Maybe one more student, sorry, and then I'll go to you, Sue.
Hi, Julie
Hi.
Serrano. Just, I guess what I'm about to say is not based on data, just a mere observation as a young person. A lot of the actions and political movements that have been happening, whether it be DACA or whether it be the March for Our Lives, have been kind of retroactive towards major events that have been happening in terms of policy and in terms of who is in power. My question is, how do you promote young people to be proactive towards these issues, and instead of waiting for something hugely negative to occur?
It's a really good question. Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any suggestions? I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, the first thing that popped in my mind is seeing some successes. So if you're able to see the positive effects of your involvement on an issue, and I think even in the short lifespan of the March for Our Lives movement, they've seen, not just the number of people that showed up at the march, but how many marches there were. I think that gives you a sense of confidence that, maybe we can do something. So my first instinct is just opportunities to see successes and really recognize how much power the generation does hold, just based in numbers alone and unique outlook. I don't know, do you have any other thoughts on how to do it?
I guess
forward-looking with it?
Also, I guess, promote a sense of education towards what these issues are, what they actually are, and what's actually happening. I think that a huge stigma with a lot of young people is that they don't know what they're talking about. Many times they really don't know what they're talking about. So educating them on these issues and what actually is going on will I guess, create proactive.
Maybe, and I
steps.
think even, and again, you've seen it in some ways it's been done well, in some ways it's done poorly. Not being dismissive of young adults who are expressing their political opinion or just sort of poo-pooing them. And I think you've seen, again, legislators who really have seriously embraced the involvement of young adults and others who certainly haven't. So that might be another way to encourage them to take a seat at the table. As I said earlier, it's campaigns. There's great research, and my students who are here know I talk about this all the time, but especially between 2008 and 2012, this assumption that young adults were going to stay with Barack Obama, and that they would vote in the same rates they did for Barack Obama, and overlooking the fact that there were at least 3 or 4 states where you'd seen some erosion of that support for Barack Obama, but the Mitt Romney campaign really didn't go into those states and mobilize young adults, and there were opportunities for the campaign to get voters out on Romney's side. So I think, again, sort of giving them a sense of legitimacy that they do and should play a role in the political process. Again, it requires young adults stepping up too and really taking ownership of it too. Sue?
Yeah, sort of in the same vein. So I'm Sue Nemeth at the Center for American Women in Politics. I've been thinking a lot about the change between the Parkland folks and the occupiers, like the Wall Street occupiers. That there was sort of it was a rejection of institutions. And this younger generation, I feel like they have a sense of entitlement that they own these institutions. And that may be the change a little bit of the change we're seeing, and I'm wondering what you think
I would
about
agree,
that.
completely, and that's a couple of the press questions I've gotten have been about that. What's different from Occupy Wall Street? And I would say that's actually a really good insight, and I think that is one. The idea, for me too, the fact that there's been a very explicit from the outset and specifically political goal. They're immediately targeting state legislators. And that came sort of immediately, whereas with Occupy Wall Street, there really was no clear goal. There was no effect that they were hoping to produce. So I think, and definitely that's a difference between the two. Someone else? Chris, I saw Chris back there. I wanted to make sure Chris got.
I feel like this side of the room is.
That's true. I'm sorry. I haven't been looking. Then Brendan. I'm sorry. Then Brendan. Yeah, it's true.
So
we can
Chris
do it over
Moret,
lunch.
From Rutgers staff, nice to work someplace where you can just go after work and hear a national expert on an important topic.
My pleasure.
So I feel like one thread through almost every comment is there are different things that lead somebody to vote, from caring to thinking it matters to getting off your butt on election day. So on that point, I'm wondering 2 things. How do what I'll call voter suppression efforts on the one hand, or pro-voting things like early voting, do they disproportionately affect younger voters? And then maybe a backup question is, what is the state of longitudinal data following individuals, not cohorts? How is the state of the data on likelihood of voting?
Voting.
But that's a backup question.
That's a backup question. So the first one, I'm sorry. So the first one is.
Voter suppression and early voting, disproportionate
so
effects.
Definitely it, of the states, as everybody knows, every state can hold an election differently, and the electoral law varies by state. There's definitely good data coming out mainly from CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, out of Tufts, CIRCLE. That really has looked at, really compared voter turnout rates among younger cohorts compared to older cohorts. In those states that have the sort of electoral conditions that favor participation. And definitely you saw states with either early voting, same-day registration in particular. I would say the data on voter ID laws is not definitive yet as to whether or not it really has an unfair burden on young adults, but certainly electoral laws that make the voting process more accessible has resulted in better turnout rates in those states. Now, the one thing you also could say, though, is, and the caveat is, the kind of correlation causation question is, the pushback or the counter argument is, well, on those states where maybe there is same-day registration, where that is favorable to young adults, we also know that campaigns know that too. And they know if there are a lot of young people in a state and there is same-day registration, it would make good sense if you were in a campaign to go target your mobilization efforts in those states like a state with same-day registration. So it's a kind of correlation causation. Is it because of the electoral law, Or is it because that affects the campaign activities of candidates? And as I said, there's a lot of literature that shows the importance of mobilization. So I'd say, and I don't know it's kind of a chicken or the egg question. This isn't a scholarly answer, but I always think whenever we can make it easier, we should be making it easier. And so if it's automatic voter registration or same-day voter registration. As far as longitudinal data, there is a lot of longitudinal data for all age groups that just says if you start voting early, you're going to be a lifelong voter. So there's a lot of benefit in either high schools or colleges or both, encouraging and facilitating voter participation early on, because the earlier you start voting, the more likely you are to continue to vote throughout your lifetime. Brendan.
Hi, I'm Brendan,
Hi.
and I'm the first employee. My question, I think I want to play off of a little bit of what's going on the other side of the room, but also really just tie together the three groups that you looked at,
Yeah.
San Bernardino and kicking the can kicking back and
Young Invincibles?
Yeah, the Young Invincibles. One thing that I picked up on that stuck with me was Young Invincibles is still around because they have enough money to get an office on K Street.
Absolutely.
And San Bernardino is still around because they were really focused on what's going on in their own community.
And not spending money on an office.
Yeah. Do you have any, recommendation for people that want to get young folks who might be watching on Facebook or something like
Right.
that, trying to focus on local versus getting them to sign a petition of a national group and what that can do?
I think, that's a great question. And I think one thing I omitted when I was talking about sort of this unique qualities of the generation, and this comes up a lot in our conversations about the most recent political campaign, but the desire of the generation for authenticity, and to be ability to spot inauthenticity a mile away. So I think that's what's one of the other things that's very appealing about San Bernardino generation now, and local issues, the work that we do in New Brunswick High School, the work we do with students or young people in New Brunswick, helping them understand that the quality of their everyday life is probably much more influenced by their Board of Education and their City Council than by the President and the members of the House of Representatives. And if you can tie it to your everyday interests, I think that's what's so interesting and appealing about San Bernardino generation now. So, for example, one of the reasons they have so many videos on YouTube is because one of their most prominent, dedicated members takes videos and is a photographer. And Michael Segura, the young man who really created it, is a graphic artist, and he specializes in graffiti art also. So he certainly wasn't abandoning these careers to focus on politics, but was trying to find ways in which, how are the arts in San Bernardino affected by local politics? So I think whenever you can weave it into your everyday life, and then helping you understand not only how politics affects your everyday life, but how you can affect politics. Okay, have I exhausted everyone? Okay, again, thank you all very, very much for coming, and keep coming back. Thank you very much. Thank you.